It's about dreaming again. Dreaming again. Remember, this is the United States of America.
Hello, Florida. Hello, Florida. We love you, Florida.
I can tell you, you will be in very good hands when Andrew Gillum is elected governor.
Rick Scott always delivers for the people of Florida. Rick Scott, please come up. Rick.
Are we not honored to have President Donald Trump in Florida?
Ron will keep your taxes going way down, jobs going way up.
Just when you thought the election cycle couldn't get any longer in 2018, here we are back in South Florida and still counting votes. So welcome back, everybody. I'm Tom Hudson with WLRN, Miami Herald News. Wonderful to have you back in the room here as we continue with our 2018 Influencers Series and the Florida Priority Summit with the Miami Herald. So one of the benefits of having a summit with a couple of news organizations is you get the latest information. So Broward County is 42% finished with its recount. About 300,000 of the 700,000 votes have been recounted in Broward County, and the Supervisors of Elections Office remains confident that they will be finished with that recount by the state-mandated deadline. Now, does anybody have a Leatherman that could get up to Palm Beach County and help repair some ballot counting machines and get that recount undergo? Listen, they haven't started yet in Palm Beach County. So let's talk about where we are in the recount and what that tells us about going forward. What might the recount from the year 2000 tell us about this year's recount? Please welcome to the stage our full panel to discuss this with loads of experience in Florida election law and Florida elections, moderated by the Miami Herald's Amy Driscoll. Panelists and Amy, come on up here. All the faces are pretty calm, I have to say, here, given the stakes.
And voters are in active status.
Well, good morning, everybody. Glad to see you here. We are here, and these are words I cannot believe I am saying, to discuss the 2000 election. I think we all have felt a sense of deja vu lately. We are 6 days past the 2018 election. We're in recounts as we were in 2000. There are a lot of differences also to 2000, but we're going to talk about some of the similarities and some of the differences as we go forward. But in 2000, just to give you a little bit of refresher for those of us who were there or those of us who were not, it was the presidency that was in the balance, the leader of the free world, as we all said at the time. And it came down to 537 votes. And those votes were in Florida. And there was a statewide recount going on that the Florida Supreme Court had ordered. And then the US Supreme Court shut it down and declared George W. Bush the winner. So that's where the 2000 election ended after 5 weeks of wrangling where no one knew who the new president was going to be. Today, the stakes are slightly different. We have 3 races that are being recounted. And we'll talk more about that. But what I'd like to do is introduce the panelists and ask everybody to say very briefly where they were in the 2000 election. These are all very experienced people who have a lot to talk about and talk about what we can learn from 2000 as we look at the election today. I'm Amy Driscoll. I'm an editor at the Miami Herald. And at the time, I was a reporter. And Mark Seibel, who is on the panel, was my editor who sent me to Tallahassee. And I stayed there for the duration of the recount. So I remember it very well. And it was a very intense period of time when no one knew what direction this country was going to go in. So at the far left, my far left, is Mark Seibel, my editor at the time, now national security editor at BuzzFeed. Next to him is Ed Pozzuoli, sorry, Ed, CEO of Tripp Scott Law Firm and a member of the Bush legal team at the time. And next to me is Kendall Coffey, attorney and founding member of Coffey Burlington and member of the Gore legal team. So we have a pretty balanced panel here. The first thing that I thought we might talk about is, what do you think, looking backwards, do we see the fruits of today in the 2018 election? And for me, the first thing that I think of really is the discourse that we see today, the vitriol, the divide, and the attacks on institutions, which we're seeing, especially the elections system. So, Mark, I don't know if you want to take the first shot at that.
Sure.
And as you go through, please talk about who you are and what you...
Okay. Well, I was the, I don't know what my title was then, assistant managing editor or something. But when, if you remember the trajectory of all of that, the first thing that happened in Florida, for me anyway, that led to our decision to go about reviewing all the undervoted ballots was Miami-Dade County's canvassing board shut down a count. And it shut down a count because there was what's known as the Brooks Brothers riot, when a bunch of people showed up and began beating on the canvassing board doors. And you know, you watched it, you thought, well, it's a bunch of local people wanting the canvassing board not to count the ballots. It turns out it was a bunch of congressional staffers from Northern Virginia who had come down. I remember watching that scene and watching them shut it down and saying, hey, those ballots are public documents. We can get them and count it ourselves. And so we immediately filed suit against the Dade County. We were given the right to count the ballots. And I was never more relieved than when the Florida Supreme Court ordered a statewide recount. I thought, thank God we don't have to do that. And then, and then when the Supreme Court stopped the recount, the U.S. Supreme Court stopped the Florida recount, you know, by the next morning we'd filed Freedom of Information or Open Records Act requests with all 67 counties, and that was a much bigger mess for us. But I remember, and I thought about it as I saw these demonstrations happening in Florida again, I thought, man, nothing ever changes. And it was, again, the Republicans who were out protesting. And I thought that is so unnecessary, because one of the things we learned from the review of ballots is that you're protesting something that may actually help you. And that ultimately was what we discovered in the ballot review, is that the Democrats had picked the wrong counties to sue in. The Republicans had picked the wrong position to take, that they wanted the strictest standard for judging a ballot possible. And what we learned is that that strict standard would have actually led to Al Gore getting more ballots had the recount been finished. And so disputing these things in court without really knowing what's the impact is going to be can work against you. And that's, you know, the first thing I noticed about this. Then, of course, the final thing is I've been very proud of Florida since 2000, because it replaced all its voting machines. And then when those voting machines didn't work so well, they replaced them again. And I thought, well, that's just great. Here we are 18 years later, and we have ballot counting machines that overheat, you know, that can't do the job that they're assigned to do. And I keep thinking, how can that still be? Don't we have these machines going all the time so somebody knows it's a problem? And then there's this problem with the Broward ballot. Don't people look at ballots? There's actually standards for ballot design that are fairly well known. And I fault journalists a little bit in this too, that we should have a checklist of things to look at and warn people about. So if there's a hidden election on the ballot, hidden down under some instructions, that should at least be pointed out. But somebody should have said to the Broward supervisor of elections, you know, that's really not the right way to do it. move it someplace else. And there is no, I mean, they're the ultimate authority for each individual ballot, but really, somebody ought to be in a position that can say, you've made a mistake in where you've placed this race. People aren't going to be able to find it, or a lot of people will ignore it. And I think a lot of those inefficiencies, I'll just call them, in the system, are there intentionally, because the politicians who are elected, well, what could be wrong with the system? They got elected. But there's lots wrong with the system. It needs to be maintained. Money needs to be spent. And I guess that's the disappointment I feel watching this from afar, is that strides I thought the state had made, it turns out they didn't quite go far enough. Anyway, that's
I actually disagree with Mark.
Shockingly.
Shockingly. I'm Ed Pozzuoli. In 2000, I was the head of the Bush-Cheney legal team in Broward and Palm Beach. That was my responsibility. Let me just touch on relatively where we are today compared to where we were back in 2000. First and foremost, the difference is obvious. In 2000, the race was for the presidency. The race was 535, 36, 37 votes separation. And today we have basically 3 statewide races. One, the Ag Commissioner, which is the closest, which has the Democrat Nikki Fried now up by some 5,000 votes, 1,000, not 500, 1,000. Rick Scott, the U.S. Senate, in the U.S. Senate race, is ahead of Bill Nelson by over 12,500. And Ron DeSantis is right now besting Andrew Gillum by some 34,000 votes. So that's a big difference. The second difference is that since 2000, Mark alluded to it, the equipment has changed. We no longer have a Chad flurry. Every time that those ballots went through the machines, Chads would fall out, and we never got the same count twice by virtue of that. Frankly, the equipment simply wasn't made to run over and over again and be handled. And so what you had at the counting tables in Broward, as an example, you had Chads all over the place. And there was one evening we did have the sheriff put some sort of crime tape around that and take a good picture. It was good news then. But you no longer have that. You have a simple scan, basically scan oval like a standardized test for an exam that you fill out. And so there's less chance. Now, obviously, when a race is somewhat close, machines do break down, right? You know, it's the law of, the other part is the legal part of this in 2000 was Swiss cheese. There was little or nothing in Florida statute that provided guidelines around a race that close in 2000. And so Democrats, it's nice to say in hindsight, went mining for votes when they went ahead and contested the races and asked for recounts in Broward, Dade, and Palm Beach. Why did they do that? Well, if you look at Broward, for every 3 votes, 2 are Democrat. And so that's the way, that was their plan. There was somebody statistically said, well, if we get enough votes, we may be able to close this race. And remember, you talk about it was under 1,000 when we started, and it went down to 500 or so. And so bottom line is that there was some rationale for it. But now we have these mandatory recounts statutorily, which provide for basically if a race is 0.5%, then you run the ballots through the machine again, statewide in this case, and see what happens. That is exactly what's going on today along the process. And so my guess is that there'll be, in fact, some counties have already reported, and there's been some movement, but the net movement is not a whole lot. It's probably 10 or 20 votes either way in the various races. And so come Thursday, there's no hard deadline, by the way, this whole thing about these lawsuits, there's no hard deadline. If the supervisors of office do not report come Thursday at 3 o'clock, the Secretary of State will take their initial number, put it in the total, and then determine what races are going to be or fall below the now 0.25, which requires a hand recount under statute now. And so that will be the process likely for the Ag Commissioner's race and the U.S. Senate race that the Secretary of State is likely to order Thursday afternoon. And so no one stops counting after Thursday if you missed the deadline. You still have to finish up the machine recount. In fact, machine recount is a preamble to a hand recount, because what they do is they run the ballots through, and then when the machine comes out, they call out the overvotes, meaning those where people voted twice in the race, or undervotes where they skip the race altogether. And all of those will be examined in the hand recount, and that's it. And so that's where we're headed in for this weekend, particularly on the two races, U.S. Senate race and Ag race. That is a lot different than what we saw in 2000, hugely different. And then the last point I want to make, and remembering back to Broward back in 2000, the manner in which there was a canvassing board convened and ordered a recount, a sample recount. That was the process then. They ordered a sample recount, and it didn't change the result to any great degree. And oh, by the way, I don't know if you knew this, there was argument, I made the argument, and the canvassing board voted 2-1 to shut the recount down after that. Then what happened is the Attorney General of the state of Florida, Bob Butterworth, who had never, by the way, historically, Attorney General was never involved in elections, ever. It was usually the Secretary of State's domain, issued a ruling or opinion letter that said, oh, by the way, the standard in which you're using to look to see intent, see how much light was going through the punch ballot, is wrong and needs to be liberalized. And so that was the order that came down, and all of a sudden Broward revisited it, and then by a vote to 2-1 decided to go for a full recount. That's kind of what happened, and that was a little squirrely in Broward, but then we went into a full recount, and of course other counties then followed. But there's a lot of differences between 2000 and today, and I would say that we're in better shape. But look, it doesn't, no matter what law you pass, no matter how tight your process is, and I would just say for this group, you can never eliminate the human error factor, whether it's on the voter's part, whether it's on the supervisor of elections part, whether it's on the team inside the supervisor's office. You can never eliminate that by statute. And so some of what you're hearing complaining about now comes from that. I'd rather not go into whether or not I think Brenda Snipes is incompetent or not or whatever. That's neither here nor there at this point. But the bottom line is that my guess is by next Tuesday, we'll know who will have won these races unless there's some extraordinary relief or some extraordinary move in the courthouse.
Well, Kendall, you know a lot about the legal aspects of this as well.
Yeah, I may have been one of the first Democratic lawyers brought into the team in the 2000 recount. Went up to Tallahassee the next day after the election. And the original focus had been the butterfly ballot in Palm Beach, and probably most of us here remember that. It was an awful design. We thought it violated the law. And I had been involved in a case in the city of Miami where we successfully had a number of votes tossed out, and the candidate I represented was effectively installed as mayor. So that was the original focus that we had. That was my original focus. But the logistics of challenging a bad design on a ballot, meaning, well, what do you do about it? The only thing that seemed apparent is you couldn't get affidavits from voters to say, well, I think I really voted for Gore Lieberman rather than Patrick Buchanan. The only thing you could try to do is get a revote, and that just wasn't a realistic remedy. So almost immediately, the strategy went full gear into recount. 4 counties were requested. Back then, we didn't have the mechanism we have today where you can get a statewide recount in a submicroscopic statewide election. You had to go 1 county at a time. The 4 counties that were selected were believed to be counties where there was some evidence of irregularity, including Volusia, as well as the ones Ed mentioned. And the law at the time required, it was very general, but to get a manual recount, it took more than a very close margin. You had to have some kind of grounds you could point to. So all that had to be done within 2 days. We picked those 4 counties. Looking back, of course, I wish we'd have asked for a recount in all 67 counties. There's no question that would have been a better approach with hindsight, but we were on our side walking on eggshells. The idea of litigating the presidency of the United States was at the time shocking, I mean, inconceivable. And there was always this concern that dogged us, even though we were 537 votes behind, that somebody would say, enough of the lawyers in the courtroom. This is an election, you know, game over. And the minute a Democratic congressman or senator stepped up to the podium and called on Al Gore to throw in the towel, it probably would have been over. So we were necessarily more, I might say, judicious, some might say cautious in our strategies. Some who have studied the recount have concluded that the Republican lawyers were more aggressive, and perhaps so, but there's no doubt that we had to not only keep it going legally, but we had to have enough public confidence that a recount was a legitimate process to avoid a tidal wave of we're sick of this already. I think Ed's right. The processes have changed a lot. We have a statewide manual recount law and a machine recount law now. You don't have to go county by county. And it isn't subjective. It's hard and fast in the numbers. So, of course, it's not a matter for the Republicans who are ahead so far, the Democrat who's ahead so far, to decide whether or not they want to have a recount, or even for the candidates that are behind right now. That's the law. And it makes it a lot better and easier, in my opinion. We also have standards for determining voters' intent, which, of course, as we know, if we remember 2000, didn't exist back then. The Division of Elections actually has a regulation which shows you how to interpret markings on an optical scan ballot. Because, yeah, we're all supposed to fill in the oval with our pens, but some people put check marks, some people write yes, some people scratch out. And if you can determine voters' intent, the law says, let's count that vote, even if it didn't get registered by the machine. And again, these are pretty credible standards that are in the website of the Secretary of State and the Division of Election. Those things are different. Those things, in my opinion, are better. What's the same is, of course, the flaws that we see in individual voting scenarios. When you have a microscopic margin, everybody's under the microscope. And no doubt some supervisors seem to be doing better than others. I was on Fox News last night, and they asked me, gee, Miami-Dade has really got their act together. What's the problem with these other counties? Well, Miami-Dade had a mayor, Carlos Jimenez, who spearheaded an effort between elections to figure out how to make it better. That doesn't usually happen because it's a budget question, it's a resources question. We pay attention to it every 2 years, and the rest of the time there are other budget priorities. And that's not to explain or justify some of the supervisors who have been underwhelming in their response to the recount. But we remind ourselves, this process is not about a report card, who gets an A or even who gets an F among the supervisors around the state. The courts have said many times, it's the real parties in interest who are the voters. And we're not going to have somebody's vote count for less in a particular county because maybe their supervisor of election isn't as on top of the job as some supervisors in other counties. The other thing that I don't think hasn't changed is the importance of the court of public opinion. That battle is also underway, as you see, very, very actively. And does it matter? Well, I'll tell you this. My recollection of Recount 2000, it may not be everybody else's, is that when the argument was originally made that different standards for recounting in different counties was a constitutional violation, pretty much no one agreed with it or believed with it. It seemed like a very limited, unlikely argument because everybody knew there were different machines and different approaches and different signature verifications throughout the counties in Florida. It had been that way for a long time. In fact, I remember the first hearing where we argued. I had the privilege of being part of the argument on that issue, and we were successful at the beginning of the case. 5 weeks later, the Supreme Court decides, by the way, you can't have different standards for manual recounting in different counties. That's a constitutional violation. Shut down the recount. And What changed between now and then? That was certainly, many say, an unusual Supreme Court decision. Well, I think that the reality is not just that the public was wearing down on it, but that the punch card ballot was discredited. It was discredited. And so much so that what Democrats might say that a punch card ballot is the instrument of a voter's will. It's something sacrosanct in a democracy. A lot of late night comedians were treating it as a joke about pregnant chads, about dimple chads. And once your ballot, your instrument of democratic will, is seen as a joke for late night comedians, it's going to be mighty tough to bridge any gap, even 537 votes.
We have a question from the audience, Amy. Based on your experience, what legal maneuvers do you expect the teams currently working on this to be approaching now?
Well, Ed, you want to start with that one? And let's try to keep it brief so we can get a few questions in.
My view of this is, comes from the governor-elect standpoint. So I don't think that
the governor-elect,
the governor-elect meaning DeSantis. I don't see that. I don't see him actively seeking litigation and in the court. From a Scott standpoint, he has been very active. Most of what they have pushed through litigation is what they would say is protecting the process, meaning they have secured ballots. They have tried to get public records requests responded to by the various supervisor of elections. The media, in fact, along with Scott, sued the Palm Beach superintendent, supervisor of elections, so they can get actually inside the canvassing board room. The idea that you would exclude the parties and the media from that kind of process should worry us all in a certain sense. And look, I'm not suggesting anything nefarious was happening, but it does add to the black helicopter conspiracy slice of our population who says whatever says, all of that. It just adds to that. Those kinds of things. You have enforcing the law. So there's basic things that you've seen that Scott has done to try to get, particularly like Brenda Snipes, to comply with providing updates. You know, election night, at the end of election night, pretty much, every supervisor has to report how many ballots they have in-house, whether they're absentee early or on election day, and that's the finite group. So you understand the universe. Broward reported something like 660,000 ballots, and that grew to 714,000 in the next 3 days beyond the statutory requirements. And so that again lent to this idea, suspicion about where did those ballots come from, all of those things. So
I think
those are the issues.
I think both sides are going to say they're trying to enforce the law. I mean, that's going to be
the real question is going to be this: if we have to count every ballot, which I think we're doing, right? We have to make sure that we count every lawfully cast ballot. And so,
well, that's what canvassing boards are for, and that's what we have mechanisms.
But go back to what Kendall said. This idea that voters' intent. We need to count every lawful ballot. I don't think anybody disagrees with that. The question, though, is that there are positions of varying people who, okay, hey, somebody missed a race on a ballot for whatever reason, because the reason could be ballot design. It also could be, we've seen flyers, as an example, in this past race that had urging voters to go vote for Gillum and Amendment 4 and no one else. And so if voters listen to that, they skipped over the Senate race, potentially. You can't glean intent from an empty, with no markings on it. So that becomes a real issue. So every lawful ballot in Palm Beach, there was a provisional ballot cast in Palm Beach by somebody who was an American citizen. And the canvassing board rightfully denied it, but the Democratic lawyers objected to to denial. I don't understand that at all.
Well, there's a scorched earth technique going on here from both sides.
Yeah, but
let's give Kendall a shot at that.
Well, there are three things I would look at. One is, in our view, not necessarily Ed's view, we think Republican litigation challenges are intended to send the message that some of these supervisors, especially in the Democratic counties, are incompetent and you shouldn't trust their work. From the side of the Democratic strategy, I think the focus is on constitutional issues which we would say require that voters in Palm Beach, even if their supervisor doesn't have it ready by the deadlines, their votes need to be considered on the same terms as voters in any other county. And it's a denial of equal protection if they don't extend the time for recounting. And the second Democratic constitutional challenge is on the idea of signature verifications. When signatures are matched from the ballot to the signature on file with the voter, there are obviously discrepancies for all kinds of human reasons. Do the standards vary from county to county? Heck yeah, that's undeniable. Should that discrepancy from county to county rise to the level of a constitutional challenge? The Democrats say yes, and essentially you can't use the signature match law, a state law, to deny votes. The third area, which may not happen, after all this recounting is done, of course there is a window for filing something called an election contest under state law. No one's talking about that, and that may not happen here, but certainly, as we recall from the Bush-Gore years, the final trial in Tallahassee was an election contest. Right. And depending on how it turns out, that remains at least a statutory option under Florida law.
And how do we feel about Bay County and the emailed, faxed ballots there?
Well, I'm not going to speak for the team, but I wouldn't fight over those votes.
And I think
really wouldn't. But
so
I'm not speaking for the Democratic Party on that.
Yeah, Kendall, just so we're aware of the scope of that, I think it's less than
it's
20.
A minor, yeah, it's a minor number.
It was 20. The question,
if every vote should be counted, every vote should be counted, right? I mean, that's what we're talking about here.
It goes back to what Kendall said. I think that's a PR nightmare for someone to try to discount those 20 ballots because someone faxed them in because their home was blown away.
Right.
That becomes a PR nightmare.
And yet, probably a violation of the law.
Amy,
yes.
We have a question for Mark Seibel. I think we've seen different responses from candidates in 2000 and in 2018. It seems President Trump and surrogates and candidates are adding division in the midst of this recount moment. How do you see differences then and now with how candidates engage in the process?
Well, actually, I don't see much different because I think the intent of in both instances was to discredit the process. And that was what happened in 2000. It was more of an intimidation effort, but certainly currently it's to discredit the idea that counting every vote somehow is counting illegally cast votes. So I don't see that difference, and I'm a little surprised, or maybe not, to see that consistency. Because I think that was the goal in 2000, and I think it's the goal now. Fortunately, as Ed pointed out, we do have actual mandates now in Florida law when you must recount ballots. Right. And that is a huge step forward, and it's going to go forward whatever the president or anybody else has to say about it. It's the law, and it's real specific. And it's easily fulfilled. So I think that's where we're at an advantage now, but I don't think the ultimate goal is any different now than it was then.
Ed, do you have some sort of take on the idea that there is an effort to discredit the election system?
No, not the election system itself, no. And I do want to preface this. The canvassing board, both in Broward and Palm Beach, they're working 24 hours a day.
But the perception out there's a lot of discussion of fraud.
Look, it is because of the difference between 2000, something we didn't talk about, is the level of how people receive their communications today versus then. So you have full-blown news networks 24/7 who need to fill time, who are driving.
What we didn't have.
But you don't have internet. You don't have the same. Media. You don't have social media. You don't have, and so. And you cannot dissuade somebody whose suspicions in their mind turn real. But what you can do is you can try to live up to the of the law and kind of walk right, you checkpoint the law, and this way there's no suspicion whatsoever. And to be blunt about it, for whatever reason, both Broward and Palm Beach have done some things that are outside the law and failed to comply. Does that mean that everybody should be suspicious about it? Was there bad intent? I'm not going to go there, but it does lend itself to a segment of the population, both on the left and right, around suspicion. I would say to you this, the worst thing that Democrats want is for a debacle in Broward and Palm Beach to occur. They want those votes counted, and they want them counted quickly. And I think that the same goes for Republicans at this point, given where the respective candidates are vote total, because in the end, it should not be about lawyers and lawyers' arguments. It should be about the math of the vote. And so today, there's a far different cry than where we were in 2000. When you're within 537 votes in the 2000 presidential versus where you are today, think about that. If we end up somehow a week from now, 2 weeks from now, when there are more votes found somehow and we flip, and these races are flipped, I'm not so sure there's going to be a huge acceptance in the public. That's the question.
I don't know how much time we have. I think we are basically out. But Kendall, I'll give you the last word since you didn't get a chance to weigh in on that.
Well, just to compare to 2000, I actually thought we were pretty cordial back then.
I think that's right. And my best friend is now Chuck Lichtman, who happened to be my counterpart in Broward.
I mean, the stakes were higher. The margin was infinitely closer. But I thought the tone was cordial. And this time, I think the tone has gotten, frankly, uglier and unnecessarily so. And it's probably just a sign of the times. But at the end of the day, it's going to be arithmetic that says who's going to win and who's going to lose this election.
Well, I want to thank you all for coming. And on that very cordial note, which is an unusual thing to say today, we will conclude our panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Amy. Thank you.